Hey guys, settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm cup of something comforting, and let's just drift. Tonight, we're going to gently float back in time, not to a grand battle or a sweeping political drama, but to something a little more intimate, a little more peculiar. We're going to visit a single night, a very specific night, in 1890. It's Halloween, of course. Not the Halloween we know today with plastic pumpkins and mass-produced costumes, but a Halloween still thick with whispers of the old ways, a night when the veil between worlds felt a little thinner and superstitions lingered like the autumn mist. We're going to explore some of the forgotten traditions, the strange customs, and the sometimes hilarious attempts to peer into the future or ward off mischief. It's a night for quiet contemplation, perhaps a gentle chuckle at the earnestness of our ancestors, and a chance to just relax into the past. So, 1890. The Victorian era is starting to creak a bit at the joints, but it's still very much present. Industry is humming, cities are growing, and gaslight still flickers in many a window. But out in the villages, and even in the quieter corners of the towns, Halloween, or All Hallows' Eve as it was often called, was a different beast entirely. It wasn't about candy corn, oh no. It was about divination, about spirits, and about a rather earnest, if sometimes misguided, attempt to control one's destiny. Let's begin, shall we, with the rather pressing matter for many young people of the era, finding a spouse. Because, of course, what else would consume the minds of those nearing marrying age? And Halloween, being a liminal night, a night betwixt and between, was absolutely prime time for peering into the romantic future. There were so many ways to do it, truly a smorgasbord of slightly odd, often messy, and sometimes outright dangerous rituals. One popular method, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, involved apples. Because, naturally, apples are always involved in everything slightly mystical. The idea was simple enough. Peel an apple in one continuous strip. If you managed this rather fiddly task, you'd then swing the peel 3 times around your head and toss it over your shoulder. The shape it formed on the floor was said to be the initial of your future beloved. Now, imagine the sheer frustration of trying to get that perfect peel, the agony of a snap, the quiet despair as your hopeful M collapsed into an indistinguishable squiggly mess. One can only imagine the whispered prayers for a steady hand, or perhaps a rather forgiving interpretation of the resulting fruit skin. Then there was the apple bobbing. Not just for fun, mind you, though it certainly was that, but also for divination. If you managed to bite into an apple, it was said you'd soon be married. If you were a bit more ambitious, you could try to retrieve an apple with your teeth and then sleep with it under your pillow. Apparently, this would lead to dreams of your intended. One can only imagine the slightly damp, apple-scented dreams of these hopeful Victorians, a faint scent of Granny Smith and destiny. But let's not forget the mirrors, because of course, mirrors are always a good way to invite a bit of spookiness into the equation. Young women would often sit in front of a mirror in a darkened room, holding a candle. As they gazed into the glass, they hoped to see the face of their future husband appear over their shoulder. Now, think about that for a moment. Sitting alone, in the dark, staring into a mirror, the flickering candle casting dancing shadows. The sheer psychological effect alone would be enough to make anyone see something. A trick of the light, a figment of a hopeful imagination, or perhaps just the shadow of a rather large moth. And if you saw a skull instead of a face, well, that was just unfortunate. It meant you were going to die before you married. Cheerful stuff, isn't it? Another rather charming and slightly more aggressive method involved hemp seeds. A person would go out into the garden, scattering hemp seeds while repeating the chant, "Hemp seed I sow, hemp seed I sow, and he that must be my true love, come after me and mow." The belief was that the spectral figure of their future spouse would appear behind them mowing. Now, aside from the obvious potential for scaring oneself half to death, one wonders about the practicality of this. What if your true love was in fact terrible at mowing? Or what if they showed up with a scythe looking a bit too intense? A lot of variables in that particular Halloween gambit. Of course, not all superstitions were about finding a husband. Some were about protecting oneself from the more malevolent spirits that were believed to roam freely on this night. Because, let's be honest, ghosts and goblins were far more of a tangible threat in the popular imagination of 1890 than they are for most of us now. The line between folklore and genuine belief was often blurred, especially in more rural areas. One common protective measure was simply to have a good fire going. Fires were believed to ward off evil spirits, so on Halloween night, hearths would be stoked and bonfires would be lit in fields, particularly in areas with strong Celtic traditions. These bonfires served multiple purposes: purification, protection, and also as a focal point for community gatherings. Imagine the scene: the crackling fire, silhouetted figures against the flames, the chill autumn air, and the whispered stories of witches and fairies.
The parlor games and a silent supper. Now that we've gathered around the bonfire and felt the chill of the night air, let's drift back inside. Imagine a Victorian parlor in 1890. Heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the dark, the scent of beeswax and roasting nuts lingering in the air, and a group of people gathered around a low table. This wasn't a night for high society balls. It was a night for the domestic, the slightly strange, and the deeply superstitious. As the evening progressed, the focus often shifted from the grand outdoors to the intimate, candlelit spaces of the home. Here, the games became more focused, more personal, and, if we're being honest, a bit more ridiculous. Of course, the Victorians took these games with a certain level of earnest playfulness, that classic 19th century blend of wanting to believe in the supernatural while also being deeply concerned about whether their lace collar was sitting straight. The Trial of the Hazelnuts. One of the more popular and decidedly less messy divination games involved hazelnuts. It was often called Nutcrack Night in some parts of England. The premise was delightfully simple. You'd take 2 hazelnuts and place them on the grate of the fireplace, right next to the glowing embers. One nut represented you, and the other represented your current crush or intended. Then you waited. You watched those 2 little nuts as they heated up. If they stayed together and burned quietly into a steady glowing ash, it was a sign of a long, peaceful, and, dare we say, boring marriage. But if one nut suddenly hissed and popped, or worse, went flying across the room with a dramatic bang, well, that was that. The relationship was doomed to be explosive, erratic, and likely to end in a very public huff. Imagine the tension in the room as a young girl watched her Charles nut suddenly decide to launch itself into the coal scuttle. Because why not just launch yourself into the abyss, Charles, she might think, while maintaining a perfectly composed, sleepy Victorian expression. It was the 1890s version of being left on red, just with more potential for facial burns. The 3 Bowls of Fate. If hazelnuts were too subtle for you, there was always the game of the 3 bowls. This was a classic choose-your-own-adventure style of divination, usually played by those feeling particularly brave or particularly desperate about their future. 3 bowls were placed in a row on a table. One was filled with clear water, one with dirty water or milky water, and one was left completely empty. The seeker would be blindfolded, spun around until they were suitably dizzy, because why make it easy, and then led to the table. They would reach out and dip their finger into one of the bowls. The clear water. This was the jackpot. It meant a happy marriage to a handsome, wealthy, or otherwise desirable spouse. The dirty water. This was the try again next year result. It predicted marriage to a widower or a life of somewhat murky domesticity. The empty bowl. This was the one everyone dreaded. It meant you were destined to remain single, the dreaded old maid or bachelor status. There's something uniquely haunting about the image of a blindfolded person in 1890 reaching out into the silence of a parlor, their finger hovering over an empty ceramic bowl. It's the kind of quiet, low-stakes tragedy that makes for a perfect, sleepy, historical anecdote. Oh, look, I've touched the void. Splendid. But if you really wanted to commit, if you were truly dedicated to the cause of Halloween weirdness, you partook of the dumb cake or the silent supper. This was not for the faint of heart or for those who enjoyed talking. To make the dumb cake, a group of friends, usually young women, would gather in the kitchen. The rule was absolute, total silence, not a whisper, not a giggle, not even a heavy sigh. They would mix flour, water, and salt, lots of salt, making it essentially inedible, and knead the dough together. Each person would mark their initials into the dough. The cake was then placed in the oven to bake. While it baked, the participants had to remain perfectly still and silent. Once it was done, they would break off a piece, eat it, a true test of endurance given the salt content, and then walk backwards to their beds. If done correctly, and if you didn't choke on the salt, you were supposed to dream of your future husband coming to bring you a glass of water. It's an oddly specific dream, isn't it? I dreamt of a man, and he was very helpful with my dehydration. But that was the charm of 1890. It was a world where a salty biscuit and a vow of silence was considered a legitimate way to interface with the cosmic forces of romance. The mischief and the gate lifting. As the night grew deeper and the adults perhaps retreated to their tea and port, the younger, more energetic crowd took to the streets. This was the era where trick-or-treat was more trick and very little treat. In 1890, Halloween mischief was a well-honed craft. One of the most common pranks was gate lifting. Young men would roam the neighborhood, unhinging garden gates and swapping them with the gates of neighbors 3 houses down. Or if they were feeling particularly ambitious, they might hoist a farmer's wagon on the roof of a barn. There was a certain accepted chaos to it all. It was the one night of the year when the rigid Victorian social structures were allowed to sag just a little. If you woke up on November 1st and your front gate was missing, you didn't call the constabulary. You just walked down the street to see if it was hanging on Mr. Henderson's fence. It was a communal, slightly annoying, but ultimately harmless release of social pressure. As we reach the small hours of our 1890 Halloween, the candles are burning low, the bonfires have collapsed into glowing mounds of ash, and the spirits, imagined or otherwise, are presumably heading back to wherever they spend their Tuesdays. The Victorians' obsession with these rituals tells us so much about their world. It was a time of rapid change, where the old rural folklore was clashing with the new industrial reality. People were reaching back to these strange, dark, and often silly traditions as a way to find a sense of mystery in an increasingly mapped-out world. They wanted to believe that a hazelnut could tell them if their love was true. They wanted to think that a mirror could show them a face from the future. It's a bit sad, a bit sweet, and entirely human. So, as you settle deeper into your pillows, imagine that 1890 parlor one last time. The fire is just a faint orange glow. The house is silent. Somewhere, an apple peel lies on a wooden floor in the shape of a crooked S. A young woman is asleep, dreaming of a glass of water. The world outside is cold and dark, but inside there's the lingering warmth of a night spent trying to touch the unknown. The 1890s are long gone, and the gates are all firmly on their hinges now. But the spirit of that night, that quiet, slightly anxious, but deeply curious search for meaning in the dark, is something that never quite fades away.
The ghost in the periodical and the tragedy of the parlor.
As the clock ticks toward the deepest part of the night, the embers in our metaphorical 1890 fireplace are turning from a bright orange to a soft, pulsating crimson. We've bobbed for apples, we've thrown hazelnut destinies into the flames, and we've endured the silent, salty trial of the dumb cake. But now, as the house grows truly quiet, the kind of quiet where you start to hear the house breathing, it's time for the stories. Because in 1890, Halloween wasn't just about games, it was the peak season for the Victorian ghost story. You see, the Victorians were absolutely obsessed with death. It sounds a bit morbid to us now, but for them it was just a neighbor. With high mortality rates and mourning rituals that lasted years, the other side felt very close. On Halloween, they didn't just want to see their future husband, they wanted to hear about the spirits who never left. So, let's settle in and look at the types of tales that would have been whispered in a gaslit room while the wind rattled the window panes. The rise of the Christmas ghost on Halloween. It's a bit of a historical quirk that we associate ghost stories so strongly with Halloween today. In the 1890s, the golden age of the ghost story was actually centered around Christmas. Think Charles Dickens. But Halloween was the dark rehearsal. Periodicals like the Strand magazine or Blackwood's would begin releasing their supernatural specials around late October. These stories weren't like modern horror movies. There was no slasher jumping out of a closet. Instead, they focused on dread, the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the room you were sitting in. A typical 1890 story might involve a gentleman who inherits a crumbling estate because, of course, everyone in these stories has a distant uncle with a suspicious amount of real estate, only to find that one specific room is always slightly colder than the rest. There's no monster, just a faint scent of violets and the sound of a silk dress rustling where no one is standing. It's a slow, creeping chill, perfect for falling asleep to because nothing actually happens for about 40 pages. The Tragedy of the White Lady. One of the most persistent archetypes in 1890s Halloween lore was the White Lady. Almost every village in England, and certainly every self-respecting castle in Scotland, claimed to have one. The story was almost always the same: a young woman, usually a royal or a high-born elite, who died of a broken heart or a tragic misunderstanding. Take, for instance, the legend of a specific white lady rumored to haunt a manor in the Cotswolds during this era. As the story goes, she was supposed to marry a duke, because why settle for a baron, but her true love was a lowly stable boy. On Halloween night, she tried to run away to meet him, got lost in the autumn mist, and, well, she didn't make it. The Victorian listeners would sigh and sip their tea, finding this tragedy deliciously melancholy. There's a certain comfort in a ghost story where the ghost is just sad. She isn't there to haunt you, she's just eternally looking for her lost stable boy. It's a very sleepless historian vibe, tragic, a bit dramatic, and ultimately quite stationary. The New Woman and the Occult. By 1890, though, the ghost stories were starting to change. This was the era of the New Woman, and the supernatural tales reflected that. Instead of just being victims, women in stories started becoming the ones who summoned the spirits. In the 1890s, there was a massive boom in spiritualism, the belief that you could actually talk to the dead through a medium. On Halloween 1890, many parlors wouldn't just be playing games, they'd be holding a séance. They'd sit around a table, join hands, and wait for rappings or table tipping. It was often a social event. You'd invite your neighbors over, dim the gas lights until they were just blue flickers, and try to contact Great Aunt Martha to ask where she hid the silver spoons. There's a funny, dry irony to it. The same people who were inventing the telephone and the light bulb were also convinced that a wooden table could jump around a room if enough people thought about their ancestors. It was a world caught between the laboratory and the graveyard. And honestly, I think we can all relate to that desire to have one foot in the rational world and one foot in the mystery. The mourning traditions. We can't talk about 1890 Halloween without mentioning the mourning customs that bled into the holiday. In the Victorian era, death was a highly choreographed performance. If your husband died, you wore black for 2 years. 2 years! Even your jewelry was made of jet, a black coal-like stone, or quite frequently the hair of the deceased woven into intricate patterns. On Halloween, those in mourning felt a special connection to the day. It was believed that the thin veil allowed them to be closer to those they had lost. Some would leave an empty chair at the dinner table or set a place with a plate of food. The silent supper we mentioned earlier sometimes took on this more somber tone. It wasn't about finding a husband, it was about keeping a seat warm for a ghost. It's a gentle, quiet image, a room full of living people eating in total silence, leaving one space for the person who used to tell the jokes. It's not scary, it's just lonely. And in the 1890s, they leaned into that loneliness. They made it an art form. The final fade to black. As the sun begins to hint at the horizon on November 1st, 1890, the magic of Halloween starts to evaporate. The white lady fades back into the mist, the hazelnut shells are swept out of the hearth, and the teenagers who moved the gates have gone home to face their father's stern looks. But for a few hours, the world was different. It was a place where the rules of science took a back seat to the rules of the soul. Whether it was the snarky irony of a failed divination or the genuine tear shed for a tragic ghost story, the Victorian Halloween was a masterpiece of atmosphere. They lived in a world of shadows, shadows from the gaslights, shadows from their heavy clothing, and shadows from a history they weren't quite ready to leave behind. As you drift off now, think of those flickering blue flames. Think of the heavy velvet curtains. The world is much brighter now, much louder, and much more certain. But every once in a while, especially on a late October night, it's nice to pull the curtains shut and pretend, just for a moment, that the mirror might show us something more than just our own reflection. The Victorian era is a long, slow sleep, filled with beautiful, tragic, and occasionally absurd dreams. And tonight, you're part of that dream. Sleep well, tucked away in the safety of the present, while the ghosts of 1890 keep their silent watch over the past.
The tonic of shadows and the autumnal cure. The sun is still hours away, and the house has settled into that heavy, rhythmic silence that only comes when the world outside has frozen in the October chill. We've explored the games and the ghosts, but now, as we drift deeper into the night, we must talk about the physical reality of living in 1890. Because while the Victorians were busy inviting spirits into their parlors, they were also desperately trying to keep their own spirits inside their bodies. Halloween marked the beginning of the dying season, that long, damp stretch of autumn and winter where a simple cough could become a family tragedy. To understand the 1890 mindset, you have to understand their medicine. It was a bizarre, slightly terrifying cocktail of genuine scientific breakthrough and, why not just drink some mercury, desperation. It was a time when your doctor might be a man of science in the morning and a man who prescribed electrified water in the afternoon. And as the damp mists of Halloween rolled in, the medicine cabinets of 1890 were opened wide. The soothing syrups of the night. Imagine a shelf in a Victorian nursery. It's dark, perhaps lit by a single sputtering candle.
On that shelf sits a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was marketed to exhausted mothers as a miracle cure for teething babies or restless children. Because why have a crying child when you can have a very, very quiet child, seemed to be the unspoken sales pitch. The secret ingredient? Morphine, and a healthy splash of alcohol. In 1890, these patent medicines were everywhere. They weren't regulated, they were just bottled vibes. You'd take a spoonful for your nerves or your melancholy, and suddenly the Victorian world didn't seem so heavy anymore. The flickering shadows of the Halloween parlor became a bit more colorful, the ghost stories a bit more believable. It's a dry irony that while they were terrified of ghosts, many Victorians spent their evenings in a drug-induced haze that made the veil between worlds feel paper-thin. They weren't just seeing spirits, they were practically inviting them to tea through a chemical door. The strange obsession with the vapors. If you weren't self-medicating with morphine, you were likely worried about the vapors. This was a wonderfully vague Victorian catch-all for feeling a bit faint, a bit depressed, or just generally overwhelmed by the sheer amount of velvet in your house. During the autumn months, the bad air or miasma of the damp streets was thought to settle in the lungs and cause a collapse of the nervous system. The cure? Smelling salts, of course, but also more elaborate treatments. There was a popular belief in 1890 that electrical therapy could jumpstart a sluggish soul. You could buy electric belts that promised to cure everything from indigestion to a broken heart by delivering a mild, constant shock to your midsection. Imagine sitting by the Halloween fire, your finger in a bowl of dirty water to find your future husband, while wearing a belt that was slowly electrocuting your liver. It's the kind of high-stakes domesticity that only the late 19th century could produce. I may be single, but at least my internal organs are buzzing. The graveyard watch and medical anxiety. There's a darker side to the medical superstitions of 1890, one that feels particularly poignant on Halloween. This was the tail end of the era of the resurrection men, the body snatchers. While the laws had changed by 1890 to provide more legal cadavers for medical students, the fear remained in the cultural DNA. People were terrified of apparent death. The idea of being buried alive wasn't just a plot for an Edgar Allan Poe story. It was a genuine, documented phobia. This led to the invention of safety coffins, elaborate contraptions with bells and breathing tubes. On a quiet Halloween night in a rural cemetery, if the wind caught a loose wire, a bell might ring. You can imagine the poor night watchman, already jumpy from the local legends, hearing a silver tinkle coming from beneath the frost-covered earth. Is it a ghost, or is it just Mr. Higgins realizing he wasn't actually dead, just very, very drunk on patent medicine? It's the tragic, ironic comedy of errors. The Victorians spent so much time trying to talk to the dead that they lived in constant fear that the dead might actually talk back, or worse, try to climb out. The arsenic green and the lead white. Even the very walls of the 1890 home were quite literally trying to kill the inhabitants. That beautiful, vibrant green wallpaper so popular in Victorian parlors, it was often made with copper arsenate. Yes, arsenic. As the damp autumn air hit the walls, the paper would release toxic fumes. And the makeup? To achieve that ghostly, pale, ethereal look that was so fashionable for young women, they used face powders containing lead and mercury. They were painting themselves with the ingredients of a cemetery while sitting in rooms that were slowly poisoning them. It adds a whole new layer of meaning to the White Lady ghost stories. Sometimes the lady in white wasn't a spirit at all. It was just a woman whose wallpaper was getting the better of her. The gentle fade of the Victorian autumn. As we look back at these medical oddities, it's easy to feel a bit superior, a bit snarky. How could they not know, we ask? But there's a quiet beauty in their struggle. They were a people obsessed with life because they were so surrounded by death. Their cures were acts of hope. Their superstitions were a way of creating a map for a territory that was still largely terrifying and unknown. On this Halloween night in 1890, the medicine bottle sits on the nightstand, the electric belt is coiled in the drawer, the arsenic green walls are silent. The person sleeping in the bed is caught in a web of science and myth, drifting off into a sleep that is hopefully peaceful, despite the strange tonics they took to get there. They were just like us, really, trying to find a way to feel better, trying to understand why things hurt, and trying to make it through to the morning. The 1890s weren't just a time of top hats and tea. They were a time of profound human fragility, wrapped in layers of stiff wool and unwavering ceremony. So, as the night reaches its deepest point, and the air in your own room feels still and safe, take a deep breath. You don't have to worry about miasmas or safety coffins. You can just be. The ghosts of Victorian medicine have all been laid to rest, replaced by the sterile, certain world of the modern day. But the shadows they left behind, the stories of their miracle cures and their quiet anxieties, still linger, like the faint scent of laudanum in an old forgotten drawer. Sleep now. The damp mists of 1890 are receding. The bells in the cemetery are silent. The world is at peace, and the only thing left to do is let the weight of the past carry you into a long, dreamless rest.
The morning after, All Saints' Day and the return to order. The candles are finally guttered out, leaving behind nothing but thin, wispy trails of gray smoke that dance for a moment in the cold morning air before vanishing. The heavy velvet curtains, which held back the spirits and the secrets of the night, now begin to glow with a pale, sickly light. It is November 1st, 1890. All Hallows' Eve has folded itself back into the shadows, and the world must now wake up to All Saints' Day. It's the morning after the metaphysical party, and if you've ever felt that specific, groggy melancholy that comes after a night of intense storytelling and sugar-induced divination, you'll understand exactly how the Victorians felt. There's a dry irony in the way the 1890s transitioned from the supernatural to the mundane. One moment you're staring into a mirror hoping to see a ghost, and the next you're worrying about the soot on your fireplace and whether the milkman is running late. The transition was sharp, structured, and, true to the era, deeply concerned with appearances. The Great Victorian Cleanup. The first task of the morning was, predictably, to erase the evidence of the night's nonsense. In thousands of middle-class homes, housemaids and mothers were early afoot, sweeping up the remains of the festivities. Imagine the scene. The floor is littered with charred hazelnut shells, sticky patches of spilled cider, and that one continuous apple peel that didn't quite form the letter M after all. There's something inherently sleepy about the sound of a broom on a wooden floor in the early morning. It's the sound of order being restored. The dumb cake that sat in the kitchen, half-eaten and rock-hard with salt, was unceremoniously tossed into the bin. The bowls of water, clear, dirty, and empty, were emptied into the garden. The Victorian world did not like to linger on its superstitions once the sun was up. By 8 a.m., the parlor had to look as though no one had ever dared to whisper to a spirit or dream of a future husband. It was back to the rigid, buttoned-up reality of the 19th century workday. Because, of course, the British Empire didn't run on hazelnut divination. It ran on punctuality and very stiff tea. The return of the gates. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to the practical jokes of the gate lifters. As the mist cleared, respectable gentlemen in top hats would step onto their porches, only to find that their front gate had been replaced by a wheelbarrow, or perhaps was missing entirely. There was a ritualized walk of shame for the young men of the village. They had to go out and retrieve the gates they had moved, swapping them back with a mixture of sheepish grins and feigned innocence. It was a communal labor. Neighbors who might not have spoken for weeks would find themselves helping each other lift a heavy iron gate back onto its hinges. Morning, Arthur. I believe your gate is currently hanging from the oak tree behind the church. Thank you, Edward. And I believe your garden bench is in my pigsty. It was a social lubricant, a way to mend the tiny tears in the social fabric that Halloween had caused. By noon, the chaos was gone. The world was bolted and barred once again, safe and predictable. The trick part of the holiday was over, and the Victorian sense of propriety was firmly back in the driver's seat. But All Saints wasn't just about cleaning up pranks. It was a deeply religious and solemn day. For the more devout, this was the time to visit the church and the cemetery, this time for prayer rather than thrills. The white ladies and the specters of the night before were replaced by the blessed dead. In 1890, this was a day for graving. Families would head to the local cemetery, not with fear, but with brushes and fresh flowers. They would scrub the soot and moss from the headstones of their relatives, a quiet, rhythmic labor that served as a meditation on mortality. It was a strange contrast. On October 31st, the dead were scary, mysterious entities to be summoned or warded off. On November 1st, they were simply Dear Father or Baby Mary, loved ones whose names needed to be kept clean from the London fog. There's a peacefulness to this image, a cemetery filled with people in black coats, working in near silence, the only sound the scratching of brushes and the distant tolling of a church bell. It was the sobering up after the supernatural intoxication of Halloween. The lingering dread. Even with the sun up and the gates back on their hinges, a certain mood lingered. The 1890s were, after all, the decade of fin de century, the end of the century. There was a general feeling that the world was moving too fast, that the old ways were dying, and that something unknown was waiting in the 1900s. The Halloween stories didn't just disappear, they moved into the gossip of the breakfast table. Did you hear that the Smith girl actually saw a skull in her mirror? Nonsense, dear. Pass the marmalade. But beneath the dismissal, there was a tiny seed of doubt. The Victorians were masters of the suppressed shiver. They lived in a world of absolute certainty, science, industry, empire, but they kept their ghosts in the basement, just in case. As the morning wore on to a gray, drizzly afternoon, the sleepless historian vibe reached its peak. The excitement of the holiday was gone, leaving behind a dull, cozy exhaustion. The gas lights would be lit early because of the heavy clouds, and the family would gather for a quiet dinner. The conversation would turn to the mundane, the price of coal, the news from the colonies, the Queen's health. The veil had thickened again. The spirits were gone. And so we leave our friends in 1890. They're heading to bed early tonight, tired from the emotional roller coaster of the previous 24 hours. The house is warm, the doors are locked, and the electric belt is tucked away. They have survived another Halloween. They have peeked into the dark and survived the view. As you listen to my voice now, let that same feeling of the morning after wash over you. The mystery is solved, the pranks are over, and the world is exactly where you left it. There's nothing to fear in the shadows, because even the Victorians, with all their tragic ghosts and poisoned wallpaper, eventually had to wake up, have a cup of tea, and go back to work. The history of Halloween is a history of us trying to be brave in the dark. It's a story of how we turn our anxieties into games and our grief into legends. And as 1890 fades into the distance, let it take your worries with it. The gates are back on their hinges. The fire is a pile of cold ash. The world is quiet, safe, and very, very sleepy. You've traveled 1.5 hours through the mists of the past. You've seen the monarchs, the monsters, and the medicine bottles. Now it's time to close the book. The Victorian parlor is dark, the carriage has pulled away, the only thing left is the soft, rhythmic sound of your own breathing. Sleep now, drift away into the long, calm silence of history. The 1890s are waiting for you in your dreams, but they are gentle now. They are just stories, just whispers.
just sleep.
The Tudor mirror, fashion, lead, and the cost of majesty. The Victorian fog has finally lifted, and as we drift even further back through the corridors of time, the gaslights fade, replaced by the flickering, guttering orange of beeswax candles and the smell of roasting venison. We have left 1890 behind, and we find ourselves stepping onto the rush-matted floors of a Tudor palace. Specifically, it's the mid-1500s. If the Victorians were obsessed with the ghosts of the past, the Tudors were obsessed with the theater of the present. And nowhere was this theater more dramatic, more tragic, or more physically taxing than in their fashion. To be a royal or an elite in the Tudor court was to be a living monument. You weren't just wearing clothes, you were wearing an architectural statement of power, fertility, and sheer, stubborn wealth. But beneath the silk, the gold thread, and the pearls lay a reality that was, quite frankly, a nightmare for the human body. As we settle into this new chapter, let's look at the most dysfunctional wardrobes in history, where looking like a god usually meant feeling like a prisoner. The Great White Mask of Majesty. We must start with the face. By the time Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, reached the later years of her reign, she had transformed herself into a human icon. Following a bout of smallpox that left her skin scarred, she turned to the most famous and most lethal cosmetic of the age, Venetian ceruse. Imagine a thick, pasty mixture of white lead and vinegar. It was applied in layers to the face, neck, and chest to create a smooth, marble-like complexion. It was the filter of the 16th century. Of course, the irony here is almost too heavy to bear. To look youthful and pure, the queen and her ladies-in-waiting were literally painting their skin with poison. Over time, the lead would seep into the pores, causing the skin to gray, shrivel, and lose its elasticity. And the solution? More lead. They would double down, applying even thicker layers to hide the damage caused by the previous ones. It was a cycle of toxic vanity. By the end of her life, Elizabeth's mask of youth was often a quarter-inch thick, so stiff that a genuine laugh might cause it to crack like a drying lake bed. It's a quiet, tragic image. A powerful woman sitting in a dark room, her face a frozen, poisonous sculpture, unable to truly express the grief or the exhaustion of a long reign because her makeup wouldn't allow it. The architecture of the farthingale. Moving down from the face, we encounter the farthingale. If you've ever wondered why Tudor women looked like they were emerging from a very expensive bell or a flat-topped table, this is the culprit. The Spanish farthingale used hoops of whalebone or wire to create a cone shape, but the French farthingale, popular toward the end of the century, was essentially a giant padded donut worn around the hips. Imagine trying to navigate a narrow corridor or sit in a chair while wearing a 5-foot-wide wheel of fabric and bone around your waist. It was the ultimate keep-your-distance garment. It signaled that the wearer was so important they literally required more physical space than anyone else. But the physical cost was immense. The heavy velvet skirts, encrusted with real gemstones and gold embroidery, hung entirely from the waist. It caused chronic back pain and restricted movement to a slow, gliding shuffle. There's a dry humor in imagining a Tudor banquet where everyone is trying to eat while separated by 4 feet of skirt. Could you pass the wine, Your Grace, or perhaps just hurl it over your farthingale? It was a fashion that prioritized the silhouette over the person, turning the female body into a pedestal for the family's wealth. And then there are the ruffs. Those magnificent, dizzying, pleated collars that made everyone look like their head was being served on a lace platter. At the start of the Tudor period, they were modest,
But as the century wore on, they became architectural marvels held up by support asses or wire frames and a brand new revolutionary technology, starch. The devil's liquor, as some grumpy Puritans called it, allowed these collars to stand stiff and proud even in the damp English weather. But wearing a large ruff was essentially like wearing a cage around your neck. You couldn't look down. You couldn't turn your head quickly. You had to maintain a rigid, upright posture at all times. It forced a certain kind of royal behavior, a slow, deliberate turning of the entire body just to see who was speaking to you. It looked majestic, yes, but it was born of a total lack of mobility. Imagine a room full of courtiers, all unable to look at their own feet, nodding stiffly like a collection of very expensive, very uncomfortable pigeons. It's the kind of absurdity that makes history so wonderfully human. They suffered for the ruff because to go without it was to be a nobody. The corset and the stay. Beneath all this, the ruffs, the farthingales, the heavy velvet, was the corset or the stay. In the Tudor era, these weren't yet the curved hourglass makers of the Victorian age. Tudor stays were designed to create a flat, conical torso. They were often reinforced with busks, flat pieces of wood, bone, or even metal slipped down the front. This was fashioned as armor. It compressed the ribs and shifted the internal organs, all to provide a smooth, unyielding surface for the bodice. It's said that some women would have their stays laced so tightly that they couldn't take a full breath, leading to the fainting spells that were so often attributed to fragile female nature rather than literally having a wooden board pressed into your sternum. Because why breathe when you can look like a perfectly flat triangle of embroidered silk? The irony, as always, is that this rigid exterior was meant to symbolize a rigid moral character. If your clothes didn't yield, neither did your spirit, or so the theory went. In reality, it just meant a lot of very powerful people were very, very cranky because they were constantly short of breath. The heavy silence of the wardrobe. As we watch the Tudor court drift into the shadows of the past, the weight of their clothing seems almost unbearable. We see the queen in her leaden mask, the ladies in their whalebone cages, and the lords in their stiffened ruffs and padded doublets. It was a world of sad, sickly, and spoiled elites, where your status was measured by how much discomfort you could endure without flinching. There's a tragedy in it, a life spent as a mannequin for a dynasty. But there is also a strange, sleepy beauty. The rustle of the heavy silks, the clicking of the pearls, the slow, rhythmic movement of a court that couldn't move any faster if it wanted to. As you settle into your blankets, feel the lightness of your own clothes. No whalebone, no lead, no wooden boards, just the soft, breathable comfort of the modern world. The Tudors are long gone, their magnificent clothes now mostly dust or fragments in a museum drawer. Their mask of majesty has crumbled, and the queen can finally breathe. Sleep now, far away from the rigid requirements of the 16th century. Let the stiffness of the Tudor court dissolve into the softness of your pillow. The history of fashion is a long, heavy sigh, and tonight you are finally allowed to let it out.